I was sitting in my car outside the base, still in uniform, scrolling on my phone the way you do when your brain hasn't caught up with your body yet. It had been a long day. Nothing dramatic, just one of those days where everything took longer than it should have, and all I wanted was silence and food that wasn't from a vending machine. That's when I saw it. A photo popped up on my feed. Bright, polished, impossible to miss. My sister Tessa standing next to a brand new SUV, one hand on the door handle, the other holding a set of keys like she'd just won a game show. The caption was simple. So grateful. Couldn't have done this without Mom and Dad. At first, I didn't think much of it. My parents had helped her before. They always did. I figured maybe they co-signed something or helped with a small down payment. It wasn't my business. I kept scrolling. Then I saw the second photo. Interior shot, leather seats, the kind of trim you don't accidentally end up with. That's when something felt off. I locked my phone, started the car, and pulled out of the lot. The thought followed me the whole drive back. Not panic, just that quiet feeling you get when a number in your head doesn't add up. Later that night, after I showered and changed, I opened my banking app. Not because I was suspicious, because I had a call scheduled the next morning with my realtor, and I wanted to double-check my numbers. We were close. Close enough that every dollar mattered. The screen loaded, and I just stared. The balance was wrong, not a little wrong, thousands wrong. I refreshed it. Then again, there was a withdrawal I didn't recognize. Large. Recent. Clean. The kind of transaction that doesn't happen by accident. I tapped into the details. My chest tightened as the date lined up perfectly with the day Tessa posted that photo. I didn't say anything out loud. I just sat there, phone in my hand, doing the math I already knew was correct. That account wasn't for emergencies. It wasn't for fun. It wasn't shared spending money. That was my house down payment. Money I'd been setting aside for years. From base pay. From deployment pay. From every month I chose not to upgrade my life because I had one goal I didn't want to lose sight of. I called my mom first. Straight to voicemail. Then I called my dad. He picked up like nothing was wrong. I asked him one question. Calm. Direct. Did you take money out of the house account? There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to tell me this wasn't news to him. He didn't ask what I was talking about. He didn't say he'd check. He didn't sound confused. He said, yeah, we did. That was it. No build-up, no apology, no hesitation. I felt my jaw tighten, but my voice stayed steady. That money was for my house. He sighed like I was the one being difficult. You're gone all the time, he said. You're always on base or deployed. You're not even married yet. What do you need a house for right now? I didn't answer immediately because I was honestly trying to understand how he'd reached that conclusion. He kept going. Your sister needs a reliable car. She can't get to work without it. This made sense, and she'll pay it back eventually. Eventually. I asked him if he talked to me before making that decision. He said, we didn't think it was necessary. That's when my mom finally got on the line. I could hear her in the background already defensive. She told me I was overreacting. That family helps family, that I was being selfish for making a big deal out of it. Selfish. For wanting the money I earned. For wanting the plan I'd been building quietly for years to stay intact. I told them I had a closing timeline. I told them that money wasn't extra. I told them it was already committed. My dad said, you can wait, your sister can't. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not with anger, just a clean, sharp understanding. They didn't see my future as urgent. They saw it as flexible, something they could move around when someone else needed something more immediate. We got off the phone without resolving anything. No promises, no solutions, just that same familiar feeling I'd had growing up where I was expected to be the reasonable one. I sat there afterwards, staring at the wall, replaying the conversation, not to argue with it, to memorize it. Because for the first time, this wasn't just about hurt feelings or favoritism. This was about real consequences. I had a meeting with my realtor in less than 12 hours. The next morning, I sat in my car again, this time in a different parking lot, staring at my phone while my realtor's name lit up the screen. I answered. She started the call upbeat like always. Asked how my schedule was looking. Told me the seller was ready to move forward. Then she paused. She said they needed confirmation on the down payment by the end of the week. I told her I'd get back to her. I hung up and opened my banking app again, like maybe the numbers would change if I looked at them enough times. They didn't. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't something I could smooth over by working an extra shift or skipping a few nights out. What my parents had done didn't just hurt me. It put everything I'd been planning at risk. And sitting there, phone in hand, uniform, still pressed from the day before, I realized this wasn't going to be one of those family issues that faded if I stayed quiet long enough. I stayed in the car for a few minutes after that call, hands still on the steering wheel, because going anywhere felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. By the time I drove home, my phone had buzzed twice. Missed calls, both from my mom. I didn't answer, not because I was trying to punish anyone, but because I needed to hear my own thoughts before theirs filled the space again. They didn't wait long. That evening, my dad called back. I answered this time already knowing how the conversation would go. He sounded calm, almost upbeat, like we were picking up a conversation that hadn't gone sideways an hour earlier. He said, "Your mom's upset. She feels like you're attacking her." That was how it started. Not with the money, not with the decision, with how my reaction made them feel. I told him I wasn't attacking anyone. I was asking why they used money that wasn't theirs. He repeated the same line slower this time, like clarity would magically appear if he spaced the words out. "You're gone all the time. You don't even live here. You don't have kids. You don't have a husband. You don't need a house right now." I remember staring at the wall, noticing a tiny crack near the corner that I'd somehow never seen before, because my brain needed something neutral to focus on. I said, "That doesn't make it your money." He laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short one. The kind that says the speaker thinks the argument is obvious. "We're your parents," he said. "We're not strangers." That sentence landed heavier than the rest. My mom took the phone. Her voice was softer, but the message didn't change. She told me I was being dramatic, that the money was still in the family, that I'd get it back eventually, that my sister needed the car more than I needed a house that would just sit empty while I was at work half the year. I asked her why no one thought to call me first. She said, "We didn't think you'd say yes." She didn't say it like a confession. She said it like justification. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't about urgency or necessity. It was about permission. They already knew what my answer would be, so they decided it didn't matter. I told them I had already signed paperwork. I told them the money was scheduled for closing. I told them there was a deadline. My dad said, "Then move the deadline." I said, "That's not how it works." He said, "Everything is negotiable." It was one of those conversations where every sentence felt like stepping on something sharp. I wasn't yelling, they weren't yelling, but nothing about it was calm. At one point, my mom said, "I can't believe you're choosing money over your sister." I corrected her. "I'm choosing my future." There was silence on the other end. Then my dad said the word that had followed me my entire life, selfish. He said it like a diagnosis. That was when I understood how they saw me. Reliable when it was convenient. Difficult when I wanted something for myself. I asked one last question. "If this was Tessa's money, would you have done the same thing to me?" No one answered right away. My mom changed the subject. My dad talked about how hard things were right now, how expensive everything had gotten, how this was just bad timing. Bad timing. I ended the call without raising my voice. I told them I needed the money back immediately. I told them I wasn't asking. I told them what would happen if it wasn't returned. My dad said, "You're threatening us now." I said, "I'm stating facts." We hung up after that. Not dramatically, just abruptly, like a door closing without a slam. I sat on the couch afterward, still in my work clothes, and tried to remember a time when they'd ever taken my side over my sister's. I couldn't find one that didn't come with conditions. Growing up, I was always the one expected to adjust. If something needed to be sacrificed, it was mine. If someone needed to wait, it was me. If a plan needed to change, it was never hers. Tessa had already sent me a message by the time I checked my phone again. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask if I was okay. She said I didn't know it would be this big of a deal. That sentence told me everything. I asked her if she knew where the money came from. She said, "Mom said you weren't using it yet." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to clarify. Later that night, I pulled up the documents for the house again. The offer letter, the timeline. The numbers that had once felt solid and now felt fragile. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. I was calculating. If the money didn't come back in time, the deal wouldn't go through. There was no workaround, no backup fund, no hidden account waiting to save the day. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about reality. I sent one email to my parents. Short, direct, no emotion in it at all. I listed the amount, the deadline, the consequence if it wasn't met. I didn't explain myself. I'd already done that. Then I turned my phone off. Not to be dramatic, not to make a point. I turned it off because I needed one night where no one could argue with my boundaries. When I lay down to sleep, my mind didn't race. It stayed strangely quiet, like it had finally settled on a conclusion my body had known for years. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to make it easier for them by pretending this was normal. I stared at the email on my phone longer than I needed to, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was trying to decide whether answering it right away would make the situation feel more real. The subject line was simple, a follow-up from my realtor. I finally replied and told her the truth in the most neutral way possible. I said there had been an unexpected issue with my funds and asked how much flexibility we had on the timeline. She called me within minutes. Her tone had shifted. Still professional, still polite, but no longer optimistic. She explained what I already knew. The seller had other offers. They were willing to wait a few days, not weeks. The lender needed confirmation. The closing date wasn't a suggestion. I thanked her and said I'd get back to her. After I hung up, I sat there, phone face down on the table, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. The apartment felt smaller than usual, like it knew it was temporary, in a way I'd hoped wouldn't last much longer. I checked my banking app again that afternoon. Then again that night. The balance didn't move. No transfer, no partial return, no message saying they were working on it. Just silence. The next morning, my lender emailed asking for updated proof of funds. It wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. But every line of that email felt like a clock ticking louder than the one on my wall. I forwarded it to my parents with a single sentence, asking if they had initiated the return yet. My mom replied with a paragraph about stress and timing and how I needed to be patient. My dad didn't reply at all. I went to work like everything was fine. I did my job. I followed the routine. I answered questions. I laughed at the right moments. No one around me knew that the plan I'd been carrying in my head for years was starting to slip through my fingers. That afternoon, my realtor texted me again. The seller had accepted another offer, just like that. No dramatic language, no drawn-out explanation, just a fact. I thanked her for letting me know and told her I understood. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. I just sat there and let the reality settle in. I'd lost the house, not because I didn't budget, not because I rushed into something, not because I made a reckless choice, because the money I'd set aside for it had been used to buy my sister a car. The earnest money was gone too. It wasn't a massive amount, but it wasn't nothing. And it wasn't refundable under the terms I'd signed. That was another email I read quietly, already knowing the answer before I opened it. That night, my parents finally called again. My dad's voice sounded annoyed, like the situation had become inconvenient for him too. He said, "You're really going to let this house thing fall apart over this?" I told him it already had. He said, "That's on you then." That was when I stopped trying to explain anything. I told him the deal was dead. I told him the money they took had cost me the house and the deposit. I told him this wasn't theoretical anymore. He said, "Well, things happen." Things happen. My mom jumped in and said maybe this was a sign I wasn't ready. That maybe it wasn't meant to be. That everything works out for a reason. I didn't respond to that either. I asked one question. "Are you planning to give the money back?" There was another pause, longer this time. My mom said they couldn't right now, that they'd figure something out later, that I needed to calm down. I hung up without saying goodbye. For the first time since this started, I felt angry. Not loud anger, not the kind that makes you want to argue, the kind that settles in and doesn't leave. I opened the folder on my laptop where I kept everything related to the house. The emails, the paperwork, the timeline I'd been so careful with. I closed it and didn't reopen it. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. My parents didn't call. Tessa didn't message. It was like everyone decided that if they ignored the outcome, it might stop existing. I went back to my routines. Gym, work, sleep, repeat. But something had shifted. The idea that I could plan my life without interference had taken a hit, and I wasn't ready to pretend otherwise. One evening while I was heating up leftovers, I caught myself doing something I hadn't expected. I was mentally adjusting my goals downward, thinking maybe I should look at smaller places, farther away, later dates. That thought stopped me cold. This wasn't a budgeting issue. This was a boundary issue. I realized that as long as my parents had access to my money, my plans were never fully mine. They could be revised at any time for reasons that had nothing to do with me. That night, I changed every password, banking, email, anything tied to finances. I removed access where I could. I documented everything I hadn't before, not because I was preparing for a fight, but because I was done being careless with something I'd worked too hard for. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my sister. She wrote, "I didn't think it would cost you the house." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied with the truth. "Neither did you care to ask." She didn't answer after that. Later that day, my dad left a voicemail. He said I was tearing the family apart over money. He said people were talking. He said I needed to think about the bigger picture. I deleted it. The bigger picture had just come into focus, and it didn't include pretending this was normal. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding anymore. I was dealing with consequences. And the more clearly I saw them, the less willing I was to absorb them quietly. I didn't open my laptop to relive the past, but the silence in my apartment made room for memories I'd spent years filing away without looking at too closely. It started with small things, the kind you don't question when you're a kid because you assume every family works that way. When we were younger, Tessa was described as spirited. I was described as easy. That word followed me everywhere. Easy meant I didn't complain. Easy meant I handled things myself. Easy meant adults didn't have to worry about me. If Tessa forgot her homework, my parents laughed it off and said she was creative. If I forgot something, I was reminded that I should know better. I learned early which version of myself was rewarded and which one was expected. In middle school, Tessa tried soccer for a season and quit halfway through. My parents threw her a little dinner anyway, said they were proud she tried. When I made honor roll that same year, my mom stuck the certificate on the fridge for a week and then took it down to make room for a family photo. No one ever said I mattered less. They didn't have to. The pattern did the talking. By high school, the roles were locked in. Tessa bounced between interests. Drama club one semester, a part-time job she quit after 2 months, a community college plan that never fully materialized. Each time something fell apart, my parents stepped in with reassurance and resources. I learned to stop asking. I worked weekends. I saved money. I figured out how to fill out forms on my own because it was faster than waiting for help that never came. When I told my parents I was thinking about the military, my dad raised an eyebrow and asked if I was sure I could handle it. Tessa didn't have to handle anything. When I enlisted, the reaction wasn't pride. It was relief. I didn't realize that at the time, but I see it now. I had removed myself from the equation. One less responsibility, one less thing for them to manage. While I was at boot camp, Tessa moved back home again. My parents rearranged the house to make her more comfortable. When I came home on leave months later, my old room had become storage. No one apologized. They just said it made sense. That phrase showed up a lot in my life. When I got my first duty station, I called home to share the news. My mom listened politely, then spent 20 minutes talking about how stressed Tessa was and how hard things had been for her lately. I learned how to celebrate quietly. As the years went on, the gap widened. I advanced. I took on responsibility. I learned how to manage money because the military doesn't give you a choice. You either plan or you pay for it later. Tessa struggled, but she never struggled alone. Every time she needed help, there was a safety net. A loan that didn't need to be paid back. A bill my parents covered without telling anyone. A car repair that somehow never came out of her pocket. And every time I sent money home, it was framed as trust, as responsibility, as proof that I was the dependable one. That's how the house fund started. It wasn't one big decision. It was gradual. I sent money because I didn't need it immediately, and because my parents offered to hold it while I was moving around. It felt practical. It felt safe. They told me it was smart. They told me I was planning ahead. They never told me they thought that meant they could redirect it. Looking back, the warning signs were there. Comments about how I was never around. Jokes about how I didn't really live anywhere. casual remarks about how things were easier when money stayed in the family. I ignored all of it because it was easier than pushing back. The night after I lost the house, I remembered a conversation from years earlier. Tessa had needed help paying off a credit card. I had suggested she sell something she didn't need. My dad laughed and said that wasn't how family worked. Family stepped in. Apparently, family stepped in for her. Family stepped aside for me. That realization didn't come with sadness. It came with clarity. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was the natural outcome of a dynamic that had been in place for decades. The moment my money became useful to someone else, it stopped being considered mine. I thought about all the times I'd adjusted my expectations to keep the peace. All the times I'd swallowed frustration because it wasn't worth the argument. All the times I'd told myself it wasn't that bad. Standing in my kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, I understood something I hadn't let myself say before. If I kept accommodating this, it would never stop. My phone buzzed while I was still lost in thought. A group text from extended family. Someone had mentioned the car again. How nice it was. How proud my parents must be. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my calendar and looked at the next few months. Work commitments, training, a possible relocation, all the reasons my life stayed in motion while theirs stayed comfortable. I realized then that no one in my family actually knew how my life worked. They knew I had a steady paycheck. They knew I wasn't around much. They filled in the rest with assumptions. Assumptions that made it easier to take from me. I sat down and wrote a list. Not emotional, not dramatic. Just facts. What I had lost. What I had contributed. What had been taken without asking. It wasn't for them, it was for me. Because for the first time, I wasn't interested in being easy. I wasn't interested in being the flexible one. I wasn't interested in being the solution to problems I didn't create. The past didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt explanatory. And once I saw it clearly, there was no unseeing it. I didn't wake up that morning angry. I woke up precise the way I do before an inspection, already running through a checklist in my head. The military has a way of stripping emotion out of decisions when emotion gets in the way. You learn to separate what feels uncomfortable from what's necessary. You learn that clear lines prevent bigger problems later. I'd applied that thinking to work for years. I just hadn't applied it to my family. I started with the practical things. I logged into every account connected to my finances and removed shared access. I closed the joint account with my mom and moved what was left into an account only I controlled. I changed passwords again, this time slower, more deliberate. It wasn't dramatic. It was housekeeping. Then I opened my LES and adjusted my allotments. The monthly transfer I'd set up years ago was still there, running on autopilot like nothing had changed. I canceled it. The confirmation screen popped up, and I stared at it for a second longer than I needed to before hitting confirm. That one click felt heavier than the rest, not because it hurt, but because it marked a line I hadn't drawn before. Later that afternoon, my dad called. I answered because I didn't want this to happen through voicemail or half messages. He got straight to this point. So you're really doing this? I asked him what he meant. You're cutting us off, he said, over money. I told him I wasn't cutting anyone off. I was removing access to my finances. That's the same thing he said. I said it's not. He told me I was acting like I'd learned something dangerous in the military, that I was becoming cold, that I was forgetting what family meant. I listened without interrupting the way I'd learned to do when someone talked past the actual issue. When he paused, I said, family doesn't get to spend my future without asking. He said, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. I said, you already did. My mom joined the call a minute later. Her voice cracked in a way that might have worked years ago. She told me she didn't raise me to be this way. She told me I was hurting everyone. I asked her one question. Are you willing to return the money this week? She said they couldn't. I asked, are you willing to set a repayment plan in writing? She said I was being extreme. That was the answer. I told them I was done discussing it. I told them I wasn't going to argue or explain anymore. I told them they'd already made their choice, and now I was making mine. My dad said, so that's it. I said yes. We hung up without shouting, without apologies, without resolution. I sat there afterward, waiting for the wave of guilt I'd been warned about my whole life. It didn't come. What came instead was a sense of order, like putting tools back in the right place after working in a mess. At work the next day, nothing changed. I briefed my team. I handled tasks. I followed procedures. No one knew I'd just redrawn the boundaries of my personal life, and that was exactly how I wanted it. During lunch, a senior enlisted mentor sat across from me and asked how things were going. I gave a neutral answer. He nodded like he understood more than I'd said. "You don't owe everyone access," he said out of nowhere. "Especially not to things they don't protect." It wasn't advice. It was a statement. That night, my sister finally called. I let it ring once before answering. She didn't ease into it. She said our parents were stressed. She said I was overreacting. She said the car was already purchased, and what was I expecting them to do now? I said, "I'm expecting you to own the decision." She said she needed the car to keep her job. I asked if she'd considered returning it. She laughed like I'd told a joke. "That's not realistic," she said. I told her what wasn't realistic was assuming I'd absorb the cost of something I never agreed to. She accused me of punishing her. I told her I wasn't involved in the purchase, and I wasn't involved in fixing it. She said I'd changed. I said I finally stopped adjusting. The call ended there. Over the next few days, the pressure shifted. Messages came in from relatives who suddenly had opinions. They framed it as concern. They framed it as disappointment. They framed it as me losing perspective. No one asked why the money was taken. No one asked why no one called me first. They asked why I wouldn't smooth it over. I stopped responding. Instead, I focused on rebuilding what I'd lost. I updated my budget. I recalculated timelines. I accepted that buying a house would take longer now, not because I'd failed, but because I'd been set back. That distinction mattered. One evening, while reviewing numbers, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head. Wasn't drafting messages I'd never send. The situation was still unresolved, but my role in it was clear. I wasn't responsible for managing their emotions. I wasn't responsible for undoing their choices. I wasn't responsible for cushioning the impact of decisions made without me. I was responsible for myself. When my dad called again a few days later, I let it go to voicemail. He said I was being stubborn. He said I was choosing pride over family. He said this wasn't how things were supposed to work. I deleted the message because the truth was things had been working exactly as designed, just not for me. And now that I'd stepped out of that design, the imbalance was finally visible. I didn't announce that I was cutting my parents off. I didn't send a dramatic message or make a final call. I just stopped responding. At first, it felt temporary, like a pause. The kind where you expect someone to step back, rethink things, and come back with a different tone. But days passed and nothing changed. The messages that came through were the same ones I'd heard my whole life, just dressed up differently. My mom texted to say she was worried about me. Not about the money, not about the house, about how distant I'd become. My dad left a voicemail saying he didn't recognize me anymore, and that the military had made me rigid. Tessa sent one message that just said, "This is tearing the family apart." I read them all. I just didn't reply. There's a strange quiet that comes when you step out of a role you've played for years. At first, it's uncomfortable. You keep waiting for the cue that tells you what you're supposed to do next. When no cue comes, you realize how much energy you used to spend anticipating other people's needs. I filled that space with structure. I worked longer hours without resenting it. I signed up for additional training I'd been putting off. I went to the gym after work, instead of scrolling on my phone, waiting for the next message that would pull me back into something I didn't want to manage anymore. At night, I stopped checking my phone every few minutes. I put it face down on the counter and let it stay there. Nothing fell apart. The world didn't end because I wasn't smoothing things over. My parents didn't suddenly understand, but they also didn't change. And that consistency told me more than any apology ever could. Weeks went by. I stopped counting them. At some point, I realized I hadn't thought about the car in days. Not because it didn't matter, but because my focus had shifted. I was no longer trying to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. The silence wasn't peaceful at first. It was heavy. There were moments when I almost reached out just to make the tension go away. Not to resolve anything, just to make it quieter. I didn't. I knew what that would cost me. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend from high school while grabbing groceries. We chatted for a few minutes, catching up in the shallow way people do when they haven't seen each other in years. She asked how my family was doing. I said, "We're not talking right now." She looked uncomfortable, like I'd said something inappropriate. "Oh," she said, "that's hard." I nodded. "It's necessary." She didn't know what to say after that, and neither did I. We said goodbye, and I walked to my car feeling lighter than I expected. It occurred to me that for the first time, I wasn't trying to make my family look good to other people. I wasn't explaining their behavior or minimizing it. I was just stating facts. That felt new. My parents tried a different approach after that. Instead of calling me directly, they went through relatives. An aunt asked if I was really willing to throw everything away over money. A cousin said my mom hadn't been sleeping well. No one mentioned returning the money. No one mentioned accountability. I ignored those messages too. I wasn't angry with them. I just wasn't available. At work, things stayed steady. If anything, I felt more focus. When your personal life stops leaking into every quiet moment, your energy has somewhere else to go. I noticed small improvements. I slept better. I stopped clenching my jaw without realizing it. One evening, while organizing paperwork, I came across the folder labeled House. I almost closed it without looking, but instead I went through it carefully, not with regret, with distance. I made notes, adjusted numbers, built a new timeline that didn't rely on anyone else doing the right thing. It wasn't optimistic, it was realistic. That night, I deleted my parents' numbers from my favorites, not from my phone, just from the place where they'd always been one tap away. It felt symbolic, but it also felt practical. A few days later, my mom showed up in my inbox again. This time, the message was longer. She talked about how families go through phases, how disagreements happen, how time heals things. She ended it by saying she hoped I'd come to my senses soon. I didn't respond. The truth was I had come to my senses, just not in the way she meant. Months passed. The seasons shifted without ceremony. I noticed it one morning when the air felt different during my run. Cooler, sharper. I hadn't spoken to my parents in a while by then. I hadn't spoken to my sister either. The absence stopped feeling like something I had to justify. It just was. One afternoon, I checked my phone after a meeting and saw a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. No voicemail. I dismissed it and went back to work. The next day, the same number called again. This time, there was a voicemail. I listened to it standing in the hallway outside my office. The voice on the other end wasn't my parents. It was unfamiliar, measured, and professional. They mentioned my family's name. They asked me to call back. I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand, and felt the quiet certainty that had been building over the last few months settle into place. Walking away had given me clarity, and clarity has a way of changing what you're willing to step back into. I replayed the voicemail once more, not because I didn't hear it the first time, but because I wanted to be sure I hadn't imagined the tone. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was the kind of voice you get from someone who deals in facts and deadlines. They gave a name, a department, and a callback number. They said they were reaching out regarding my parents. That was it. I didn't call back right away. I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked back into the meeting I'd stepped out of, taking my seat like nothing had happened. For the rest of the hour, I listened, nodded when appropriate, and took notes. On the outside, everything looked the same. Inside, something clicked into place. That afternoon, I returned the call. I stepped outside the building, letting the door close behind me, so the noise dropped to a low hum. The man on the other end introduced himself and explained why he'd called. He was polite, efficient, and very clear. There had been missed payments. The account was past due. Notices had already been sent to the address on file. I didn't interrupt. He mentioned the vehicle, the loan, the timeline. He explained what would happen next if the balance wasn't addressed. I asked one question. "Why are you calling me?" There was a brief pause. Then he said my name had come up as a potential contact. He didn't explain how. He didn't need to. I told him I wasn't responsible for that account. I told him I hadn't authorized the purchase and I wasn't a signer. He acknowledged that and thanked me for my time. The call ended as cleanly as it had started. I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand, watching a car pass by on the street. Nothing dramatic happened. No rush of adrenaline. Just confirmation. That evening, my parents called. Both of them, one right after the other. I let the calls ring. Not out of spite. Out of habit. The habit I'd built by choosing not to jump every time my phone buzzed. A voicemail came in from my dad. His voice sounded different this time. Tighter, less certain. He said they needed to talk. He said it was important. He said things had gotten complicated. My mom left a message too. She sounded tired. She said they were overwhelmed. She said they didn't know what else to do. Neither of them mentioned the house. Neither of them mentioned the money they'd taken. They mentioned the car. I didn't respond that night. I made dinner. I went for a short walk. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. The next morning, I had 3 more missed calls. One from my sister. I answered that one. She didn't greet me. She went straight into it. She said our parents were stressed out. She said the situation had spiraled. She said the loan payments were behind and things were moving fast. I listened without stopping her. When she paused, I asked, "What do you want me to do?" She hesitated like she was surprised I'd ask that so directly. Then she said, "We need help. Not we need advice. Not we need time. Help." I asked her if she was asking me to pay for the car. She said, "Just until things stabilize." I told her I wasn't doing that. She reacted immediately. Her voice rose. She said I was being cruel. She said I was punishing everyone for one mistake. She said this was different. I told her it wasn't. She said, "You don't understand how bad this is." I said I understand exactly how bad it is. That's why I'm not getting involved. She accused me of abandoning the family when they needed me most. She said I was choosing money over people. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I said I didn't buy the car. There was silence on the line. She said our parents were counting on me. She said they'd never recover from this. She said I was the only one who could fix it. That line sounded familiar. I told her I wasn't fixing a problem I didn't create. I told her the car was her responsibility. I told her I wasn't paying for it, co-signing, or negotiating on her behalf. She called me heartless. I said I'm done. The call ended shortly after. My parents called again that afternoon. I answered this time because there was no reason not to. My dad spoke first. He said they were scared. He said they were facing consequences they hadn't expected. He said everything had gotten out of hand. I asked him if he remembered telling me I could wait. He didn't answer that. He said the situation was urgent now. He said time was running out. He said the family needed to pull together. I told him I wasn't stepping in. He asked me what he was supposed to do. I told him the same thing I'd told my sister. Handle it. My mom started crying. She said she couldn't believe I'd let it come to this. She said I was tearing the family apart. I said calmly, "This didn't start with me." There was nothing else to say after that. The calls slowed down over the next few days. Messages came in from relatives who'd clearly been briefed. They framed it as concern. They framed it as worry. They didn't frame it as accountability. I went about my days like normal. Work, training, evenings that felt quieter than they used to. One night while washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the window and noticed how relaxed my shoulders were. That surprised me. I wasn't enjoying what was happening to them. I wasn't celebrating. I was just no longer absorbing the impact. When my phone rang again a few days later, it was my dad. I let it go to voicemail. This time he didn't ask for help. He said they might have to sell the car. I dried my hands, set the towel down, and stood there listening until the message ended. Nothing in me rushed to respond. The problem they'd created was finally sitting where it belonged. I didn't respond to my dad's voicemail right away. Not because I needed time to think, but because there was nothing left to decide. The moment he said they might have to sell the car, something settled. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just confirmation that the situation had finally reached the point it was always headed toward. That night, my sister texted me again. She didn't ease into it this time. She wrote, "They're serious. They're talking to the dealership." I read it once and set my phone down. A few minutes later, another message came in. "If you help just a little, we can avoid all of this." I picked up the phone and replied with the shortest sentence I'd sent in weeks. "I'm not paying for it." She called immediately. I answered. Her voice was sharp from the start. She said I was being unreasonable. She said I was acting like I didn't care what happened to anyone else. She said the situation had gotten way bigger than it ever needed to be. I asked her one question. "Why is this my responsibility?" She said because I had the money. I told her that having money didn't make me responsible for her choices. She said, "You don't get it. Mom and Dad are freaking out." I said they told me I could wait. She accused me of holding a grudge. She said this wasn't about the car anymore. She said I was trying to teach everyone a lesson. I told her the lesson had already been taught. It just hadn't been learned. She said I was ruining her life over a technicality. I said it's not a technicality. It's a purchase I didn't agree to. She told me the car was already depreciating. She told me selling it now would be a loss. I said, that's what happens when you buy something you can't afford. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear her breathing. I could picture her standing somewhere familiar, waiting for someone else to step in the way they always had. She asked me finally if I really meant it. I said yes. The call ended quietly. The next day, my parents tried again. This time, they framed it as compromise. They said they weren't asking me to cover everything, just to help bridge the gap, just to make one payment, just to buy them time. Every just landed like an admission. I told them the same thing I'd told my sister. I wasn't paying for the car. Not one payment, not a partial amount, not temporarily. My dad said I was choosing to watch them struggle. I said, you chose to spend my money. My mom asked how I could live with myself if this ended badly. I said I'm living with the part where you didn't ask me. She said I was being cold. I said I'm being consistent. They tried a different angle after that. My dad said he'd raised me better than this. My mom said she never thought I'd turn my back on family. I didn't argue with either of them. I told them something I hadn't said before. If I pay for this, it will happen again. Maybe not with a car, maybe with something else. But it will happen again. Neither of them denied it. That silence told me more than any apology ever could have. At work, I stayed focused. I handled tasks. I sat through meetings. I didn't bring any of this with me. The discipline I'd built over years didn't disappear just because things were uncomfortable at home. One of the advantages of my job is that it doesn't allow room for emotional spirals. You show up, you do the work, and you move on to the next thing. That structure kept me grounded. In the evenings, my phone stayed quiet more often than not. When it didn't, I read messages once and responded only if necessary. A few days later, my sister texted again. They're listing the car. That was it. No accusation, no plea, just information. I didn't reply. Later that night, my mom called. I answered because I could hear the strain in her voice before she even spoke. She said they'd gone to the dealership. She said the numbers were bad. She said selling the car wouldn't cover everything they owed. I listened. She said they didn't know how they'd let things get this far. She said they'd assumed it would all work out somehow. I told her assumptions had consequences. She asked me quietly this time if I was really not going to help. I said not with the car. She didn't push after that. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug I'd forgotten to drink from. I wasn't numb. I wasn't emotional. I was steady. That steadiness was new. I thought about how many times I'd stepped in before the situation got uncomfortable. How many times I'd absorbed the impact so no one else had to. How many times I'd paid weighted adjusted or backed off to keep things from escalating. This time I hadn't. And the escalation had happened anyway. The difference was where it landed. A week later, my dad left another voicemail. His voice was flat now, tired. He said the car was gone. He didn't say sold. He didn't say traded. He just said it was gone. I listened to the message once and deleted it. There was no rush of victory, no sense of revenge. Just a quiet understanding that the outcome I'd been warned about had arrived exactly the way it always does when no one intervenes. Consequences don't need permission. They just show up. The silence after that voicemail felt different from the ones before it. It wasn't tense or uncertain. It was settled. A few days passed without any calls. No texts, no relatives checking in. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a decision has already been made, and there's nothing left to negotiate. Then my sister reached out again. Her message was short. It's done. I didn't ask her what she meant. I already knew. She called a few minutes later. Her voice sounded flat, stripped of the confidence she usually carried when she assumed someone else would step in. She said they sold the car. Not for what they paid, not even close. She said they took the first offer that would clear most of the loan and stop things from getting worse. I listened without interrupting. She said she'd never been so embarrassed in her life, that having to hand over the keys felt humiliating, that people knew, that the dealership treated her differently this time. I didn't comment on that. She said our parents were furious, not at her, at the situation, at how fast it all collapsed. I asked her one question. Do they understand why it happened? She didn't answer right away. When she did, she said, they think you could have prevented it. That response didn't surprise me. She went on to say that things at home were tense, that money was tight, that they were scrambling to cover what the sale didn't, that plans had been canceled, that everyone was stressed. I said, "That's what happens when decisions catch up." She snapped back that I didn't have to be so cold about it. I told her I wasn't being cold. I was being accurate. She accused me of enjoying this, of proving a point, of finally getting back at her. I said, "This isn't revenge, this is math." She hung up after that. Over the next week, bits and pieces filtered in from other people. Not directly, through sideways comments and half updates that made their way back to me. An aunt mentioned my parents were looking at selling some things. A cousin said my mom had gone quiet on social media. Someone else said my dad had been snapping at everyone. No one asked how I was doing. At work, my life continued the same way it always had. Early mornings, long days, clear expectations. The structure was grounding in a way nothing else was right now. One afternoon during a break, I caught myself smiling at something small. A joke someone made. A moment that would have been overshadowed before by the weight I carried home with me. That was when it hit me. The chaos wasn't in my life anymore. It was back where it belonged. A week later, my dad called. I answered because there was no tension left to avoid. He didn't start with anger this time. He sounded worn down, like someone who'd been forced to look at a situation without the usual escape routes. He said the car was gone. He said they'd underestimated how quickly things could spiral. He said they'd thought it would work out like it always did. I asked him what that meant. He said, "We thought you'd step in." There it was. I told him I'd been clear from the beginning, that I wasn't paying for a purchase I didn't approve. He said quietly, "Your sister's having a hard time." I said, "So am I." That caught him off guard. I reminded him that I'd lost a house because of that decision, that I'd lost money I'd earned, that I'd been told to wait because someone else needed something more. He didn't interrupt me. I told him this wasn't about punishment, that I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson, that I'd simply stopped absorbing the consequences for choices that weren't mine. He said they never thought it would go this far. I said it always goes this far, it just usually lands on me. We didn't argue after that. The conversation drifted to logistics, to what needed to be handled next, to what they were trying to sell, to how things were tighter than they'd planned for. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. When we hung up, I felt something close to relief. Not because they were struggling, but because the story had finally changed. For the first time, the problem didn't end with me. A few days later, my sister texted again. She said she was taking the bus to work now. She said it was temporary. She said she was figuring things out. I told her that was good. She didn't respond. That night, I pulled up my finances again. I looked at the numbers without flinching. The timeline was longer now. The goal was still the same. I adjusted my plan and closed the app. I realized then that nothing about my future depended on them anymore. Not their approval, not their cooperation, not their ability to manage money. That shift was subtle, but it was permanent. Later that week, a relative asked me if I felt bad. I asked about what. They said about how everything turned out. I told them the truth. I feel responsible for myself. They didn't know what to say after that. The house I'd lost still crossed my mind sometimes. Not with regret, but with clarity. It had been the moment everything stopped being theoretical. The car had been sold. The illusion that someone would always fix things was gone with it. And in the space that left behind something steadier had taken its place. I didn't rush into buying another house after everything that happened. I didn't browse listings late at night or save photos of places I couldn't afford yet. I let the idea sit quietly in the background while I rebuilt piece by piece without anyone else's hands in the process. My finances stabilized faster than I expected once nothing was being redirected. The money I used to send out without thinking stayed where it belonged. I watched my savings grow again, slower this time but solid. There was no joint account, no shared access, no assumptions. At work, I was promoted into a role with more responsibility, more hours, more pressure. It suited me. Structure always had. The military had taught me how to operate under stress without letting it bleed into every corner of my life. This was no different. I moved to a new duty station not long after. New city, new routines, new distance from everything that had once felt unavoidable. I didn't announce the move to my family. I didn't need to. They found out later through someone else the way information tends to travel when you stop volunteering it. The first time I toured a house again, it felt different. No urgency, no panic, no mental math happening in the background. Just a clipboard, a quiet street, and the knowledge that if I walked away, nothing bad would happen. The house wasn't perfect. It was smaller than the one I'd lost. The commute was longer. The backyard barely qualified as one. But it was clean, stable, mine. When I made the offer, I didn't tell anyone. When it was accepted, I didn't share the news. I went through the paperwork carefully, double-checking everything myself. I wired the down payment from an account no one else could touch. Closing day came and went without ceremony. No photos, no group messages, just keys in my hand and the quiet click of a door locking behind me. I sat on the floor of the living room that first night, eating takeout straight from the container, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a place that hadn't learned me yet. It felt right. A week later, my mom called. I let it ring a few times before answering. She asked how I was doing. Not in a probing way, not with an agenda, just the question. I told her I was fine. She said she'd heard I'd moved. She said she hoped I was happy. I said I was. There was a pause. Then she said something that would have mattered more a year ago. She said they hadn't realized how serious I'd been about the house. She said they didn't think it would change things so much. I didn't argue with that. I didn't correct it. I just listened. She asked if I'd bought another one. I said yes. She asked where. I said nearby. She asked if she could see photos sometime. I said maybe. That was it. My dad didn't get on the line. He didn't need to. There were no explanations left to give. My sister didn't reach out for a while. When she did, it wasn't about money or favors. She told me she'd started saving. She told me she was taking things more seriously now. I said that was good. We didn't suddenly become close. We didn't rebuild anything dramatic. But the dynamic had changed. The expectations were different. No one assumed I'd step in anymore. That was the real shift. On weekends, I slowly made the house feel like mine. Nothing fancy, a couch I actually liked, a table that fit the space. I took my time. There was no rush to prove anything. Sometimes while unpacking boxes, I'd think about the house I'd almost had. The one that slipped away because someone decided my future could wait. The thought didn't sting anymore. It reminded me why this one mattered. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't taken revenge. I hadn't taught anyone a lesson they didn't want to learn. I'd just stopped playing my part. The part where I covered gaps. The part where I made things easier for everyone else. The part where my goals were flexible and theirs were urgent. Life moved forward in a quieter way after that. Not perfect, just balanced. At work, I stayed focused. At home, I rested without guilt. When my phone buzzed, I checked it when I felt like it, not because I felt obligated. Family gatherings happened without me sometimes. I was invited. I declined. No explanations required. Other times, I showed up briefly and left early. I wasn't proving anything. I was choosing. One evening, standing in my kitchen, I caught myself doing something small that felt significant. I was planning ahead without factoring anyone else's needs into the equation. That was new. The money I earned stayed with me. The space I lived in belonged to me. The decisions I made were mine alone. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't losing the house or the money. It was realizing how easy it had been for the people closest to me to spend something they didn't earn. The easiest part in the end was letting them handle the consequences once I stopped interfering. I didn't cut my family off to hurt them. I cut off access to myself so I could finally move forward. And that made all the difference. If stories like this resonate with you, real family revenge stories, real-life family drama, and moments where setting boundaries changes everything, make sure you subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming, and you won't want to miss them. 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 And you won't